rules for what. My name is Sam. Long-time listeners of the show will know that I am highly skeptical of books on the alt-right as a kind of a topic generally. The book we're going to be discussing today, and with the author, who's Professor Alexandra Stern, who is a professor at the University of Michigan. Her excellent book, Proud Boys and the White Ethnostate. It's very much an exception to this rule. I think the book treats the alt-right seriously, both as a novel kind of political thinking and also as a political movement whose practice as a movement, that is what they did online and so on, influences the politics it expresses in really clear and very sharply analyzed ways. There's this dynamic between movement practice and ideology, kind of broadly conceived. And the book is a really great encapsulation of like tensions between these two things and the way that the two things inform each other, particularly in a period from kind of just before the Trump presidency or kind of even stretching back. And we'll get into some of the history about the idea of the ethnostate, which comes out much, much earlier in the kind of early 70s, I think. And then, we're going to bring it up to the present day as well. So I think lots of accounts don't get this dynamic right. So the book is really, really useful for people who are thinking about this stuff. And it's out now from Beacon Press, I think. There'll be a link in the show notes. So first question I wanted to ask you was, it's really important to think about the far right historically. It's really important to think about them as changing over time. And it's very clear that the Proud Boys, which are the titular group of the book, and you might think of other groups like Patriot Front, who've recently been producing a lot of very kind of dynamic and impressive propaganda, but have that kind of really far right ideology behind them. All the way over to kind of the National Socialist Order, which is a rebranding of a group called Atomwaffen. It's cast this hugely broad net across massively disparate groups on the far right. These are very different groups, also from the Aryan Nations, which is a group that it's kind of complicated to get into, but or the National Alliance, or these kind of groups, which were essentially neo-Nazi kind of like organizations that were prominent in the 80s and 90s, or perhaps even going a bit further back as well. How do we periodize these things? Or how should we be periodizing these things? What has fundamentally changed between the 70s, 80s, 90s and the present day? Because everything, I think, felt in 2015, when people started first talking about the alt-right, felt suddenly extremely new. And my question is like, what divisions would you make historically between these groups in the past and the groups that we are kind of now facing, or faced at least, a year ago?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. And given that I am a historian, I obviously think it's very important to historicize the far right and look at how it has morphed and changed over time and what kinds of threats it's posing today to democracy and to equality. So in terms of thinking about the more recent movement, I have been using a shorthand, Cass Mudd's waves of the far right. And, when I talk about this, not in as long as a podcast interview, but to the media, I generally just shorthanded as the fourth wave of the far right, which I think is helpful because this is distinct from the 90s. It is distinct from the 70s. It is distinct from the immediate, if we go back to we'll just go back to the post-World War II period. We could go back further into kind of the early 20th century and eugenics and fascism, and maybe we'll talk about that. But so I've been using that as shorthand, and I think that there are a few things that characterize the far right today that are new, although many of the ideologies remain the same. They remain persistently neo-fascist, patriarchal, traditional, and so on. But what's new is, first of all, the rise of the internet and social media, and the creation of this vast, crazy meta-political space, which is kind of like a godsend to white nationalists and others on the far right, because it has allowed them to do meta-political work, as they would describe it. And the second, which Mudd also points out, is the ways in which the far right has been normalized and has been mainstreamed. And we can see that both in the rise of far right actors in political parties and political representation. We see that across Europe, from Poland to Sweden to the Vox Party in Spain, to Brazil, with Bolsonaro, and obviously in the United States, where Trump really pulled the far right into the presidency in complicated ways that are going to be very hard to shake off in the coming years. That's going to be a huge task. So I'm very interested in this process of mainstreaming normalization. How does that happen? It How does the far right become so normalized and naturalized that we can't even necessarily see it? And what are some of the mechanisms of that? And because of my interest in that, and one of the things that piqued my interest in that was looking at what some have called these like alt-light actors. I don't know, that terminology is problematic, but if we think of people who are the gateways to radicalization, well, it's people like Jordan Peterson. And I don't know if the name of your podcast is a riff off of that in any way. It could be, but that is one of the gateways, as was Stefan Molyneux, who was booted off of YouTube. And he's probably using BitChute and other platforms now. So that's one thing. In terms of historicizing it, I would say that from the US side, this was all brewing in the 2000s. I mean, some of these individuals who would become key figures were building their networks and finding their footing. Many of them were actually of kind of those who have produced content, more intellectual type content. They were getting their graduate degrees. So I do think of people like Greg Johnson at Countercurrents and so on. And then really, the key year is 2008, at least in the US. That's the year that Paul Gottfried, he coins the term the alternative right. It's also the year that Barack Obama is elected, and in which there's a massive run on guns from many, particularly whites in American society, who are nervous about their Second Amendment rights. So 2008, I think, is really a turning point that a lot of people don't notice, because what that means is that these groups, some of them become more institutionalized, and some of them begin to have more of a internet presence. So you think of someone like Richard Spencer and the National Policy Institute, and Radix Journal and the other enterprises that have all since kind of fallen to the wayside. However, they're using the internet to really network and build this kind of community of far-right ideas. And then, of course, everything is accelerated moving into Trump's election and around 2015 and 2016. And so in Europe, I think that, also the 2008 doesn't make as much sense. What makes more sense in Europe is 2015 and the refugee/migrant crisis, which comes a little bit later. And I don't know all the ins and outs of the various far-right movements in Europe. I know the basic, landscape, and can do some comparison. My strength is really understanding more what's going on in the US and mapping that out. But I think it's really, I'll just finish up this segment by saying that I think the alt-right is a term that we should use with caution, because it is a term that both using it gives it the credence that those who coined it wanted. It also is a kind of a misnomer for something that is more dangerous and troublesome. However, I think it is useful for really capturing this particular moment in time between about 2008 and the 2018, let's say that 10-year period before people flee from the alt-right, abandon the term, and, kind of post-Charlottesville.
That's really interesting. You mentioned a fourth wave. I'm wondering if you could tell us what the previous three waves are. I can think of two waves, and then like that second wave seems to have like two parts to it, but maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding the American context here. Can you tell us what are those four waves that you were talking about, of which this is the fourth?
Well, that's a good question, and I'd have to go back to the book to familiarize myself with all, the way in which Mudd delineates them. But, I think the first wave is immediately after World War II. What happens with kind of neo-Nazi parties where there's been denazification and defascization, or whatever the term would be. And so those parties are, those actors and those groups are really kind of living in the margins, although they are there, like the American Nazi Party and things like that. Then by, I think the 70s, you're beginning to get the emergence of kind of more prominent far-right actors that are reacting against immigration. From their perspective, the specter of increased immigration and the kind of initial stirrings of like, the skinhead movement. And then by the 90s, we move into, at least thinking in the US context, as you were saying, kind of like Stormfront and Aryan Nation. And so and I would have to go back and look at the specific examples that Mudd uses, but it really goes, I think it's post-war, like 50s, 70s, 90s, and then, more of our contemporary moment, without going back to the 30s, which is almost like, wave zero, one could say, where, many of these ideas are cultivated in the context of, post World War I extremism and the emergence of kind of nation-based fascism.
Like, yeah, or even, I guess, even further back, right, in the first Klan, right, 1870s, yes. And so on.
Well, that's right, and because if you map it onto the U.S. more directly, it is necessarily bound up in the long history of white supremacy, which is at the crux of the founding of this country. So you can't escape it, no matter where you look.
Yes. Yeah. Excellent. I'm edified to know those are the ones I was thinking of. But I was thinking of the 1970s as transitioning fairly seamlessly into the 90s, as the militia movement goes through this kind of transition and chaos in 1983, right, where it transitions to leaderless resistance and so on. Yeah. You get Louis Beam and people like this. Catherine Bellew has a excellent book called "Bringing the War Home" about that whole period. That's great. Thank you very much for that kind of that periodization. That's really, really useful. So your book, let's kind of turn more directly to your book. So it begins, or like kind of, it seemed like you begun to read about these kind of figures through their publications, basically through their quote unquote kind of think tanks or journals. I think perhaps that's putting a too kind of lofty spin on it, but obviously that's the spin they would want. Countercurrents, Radix Journal, and Ostara publications, which I've come across much, much less than the other ones. So Countercurrents is, of course, Greg Johnson and people are like around him. Radix Journal, his most famous figure is Richard Spencer and so on, as you mentioned, the National Policy Institute and so on. I don't know who Ostara publications are at all. Could you tell us who they are?
Well, exactly who's behind them, I'm not sure, but it is one of these kind of like esoteric / neo-pagan / far right white nationalist, like that is basically it's how I would classify it. And so it has a mixture. It would like have a nod towards some of the neo-fascist icons of the far right today, like Evola and others. At the same time, they're publishing books that are like these series of books that are all about the greatness of Western civilization. So one of them is called The March of the Titans. And it looks like it has like 4 volumes and is basically tells the story of modern civilization through the triumphs of, white men and white people. So that would be an example of the type of book that they would sell, and they take their name from, kind of an ancient term around kind of old German for kind of, the rise and the new spring. So it's buying, there is this kind of organic fascist idea of rebirth behind it as well. It's not the most prominent of the houses. It is the one, though, that did release a centennial edition of Madison Grant's 1916, The Passing of the Great Race. And that is why I stumbled upon it. And in fact, one of the reasons I wrote the book is, first of all, I've tracked eugenic ideas, and insofar as eugenics is entangled with far right ideas, although it's not always entangled with far right ideas, it can be very entangled with liberal ideas and even left ideas, but that's a separate conversation.
Yes.
Insofar as it's entangled with far right ideas, I've been tracking it, like looking at ideas of biological essentialism. What is the American Renaissance doing? What are these race realists doing? So I was tracking that, and I saw it. I became more aware of some of the websites I've mentioned and some of the publications around 2015.
Yeah.
And indeed, one of the pieces that spurred me to write the book was something that Spencer had published, I think it was in Radix Journal, which was basically an essay on Madison Grant, which he presented as a very scholarly essay. In other words, it has footnotes, it has paragraphs, it has a thesis statement. And I was looking at it and I became very concerned because I thought, well, what if I just gave this to my students and said, this is the best article on Madison Grant. It's a scholarly article published on a blog, site. Would they really be able to deconstruct this and see how problematic it is? I mean, it had the guises of everything that would be like intellectual production and intellectual arguments. And again, with a graduate degree and so on, Spencer knows how to do that. But that made me very nervous. And I felt that it was important to delve into the ideas and to be able to deconstruct the ideas. And when I wrote the book, and as I was writing the book, I was reading a lot of other really interesting books, but for the most part, they were focusing on people. Like there's this, especially journalists, they want to do the storytelling through how did this person become radicalized? Then what did they do? Did they become de-radicalized? And that can be very interesting to do those biographical kind of examinations, or the focus is on a list of organizations and kind of what I would say almost guilt by association. Like if one person is connected to this organization and they know that person, then you bundle them all together. And not that maybe we should bundle them all together. I'm not saying that there isn't a kind of an associative network that we should be aware of. What I really became interested in, though, are what are the ideas, what's new, what persists. So the book is meant to be an intellectual history of the ideas of the alt-right as kind of put together during that time period. And because of that, what I did was almost everything I looked at for the book was born digital material or had become digital material. And when I set off to read everything I could that was, from in English and a little bit I can read French in published by Arctos, published by Countercurrents, as well as that had appeared in places like Takis and Radix and a few other sites, and to really delve into those and to basically provided an anatomy of some of these ideologies that did necessitate that I take a deeper dive into social media. And that's when I started really thinking through this new literature around digital studies, and particularly this idea of the affective life of digital worlds. In other words, it's not just about people, can I say this on your show, shit posting?
Oh, sure. No, I'm swear as much as you like. I mean,
okay.
Encourage it. Yeah.
So it's not just about people shit posting or being dark, dark overlords on the internet. It's also about building community and using the internet as a place to create community and nostalgia. So I became very interested in that, like what kind of emotional purchase can social media have, particularly in terms of building community among, these groups of whites who feel besieged, who feel atomized, and who feel like their community is being, taken from them.
I think that's a really essential angle. It's one that's often kind of missed from these things. So how would you think about the kind of the tension between these kind of community building structures and the ideas? Because we've got, on the one hand, we've got kind of a metapolitical kind of campaign, I guess, but it's referencing Evola and it's referencing, Alicia Madison Grant and people like that, and it's referencing esoteric things, but at the same time, it's also just like a way of talking to your friends. And I feel like there's often a kind of missing in accounts of the alt-right. There's a missing attention between high political ideas and this kind of bottom-up platform dynamics based community construction, right? So I think there's often people get one part or the other. They get either the ideas or they get, it's 4chan. And neither of these answers is quite adequate. So I wonder, what do you think it was about these ideas, or how did they produce, or were the ideas involved in the affect construction, or do you think they're actually kind of separate?
Well, I would say yes, and both. To your question, it's all of those things. The question is, how do we map it out and how do we get a handle on it? So I think a good example of where we could see kind of these multifaceted dimensions would be just look at Red Ice as an enterprise. So, I mean, red ice, in a way, for if we want to do an analysis of the far right, it provides a lot for us to work with. You have a married couple that it's a transatlantic union between a white nationalist from the US, from the Pacific Northwest specifically, and a Swedish, European nationalist, with both sharing neo-fascist ideas. You have them presenting ideology, often, it's performed in a very kind of TV or kind of video savvy way. And, they have good for these types of enterprises, they have very good production value. But however, the ideas are there, the ethnostate idea, the great replacement idea. I mean, some of the key ideologies. What's also there is the community building. And one of the ways in which I have seen this is every year, they and others actually, like Millennial Woes is done one of these. I don't know if you tracked it, one of these Yule, because they got a nod to the pagan stuff, these Yule, kind of extravaganzas where they're on, have a live stream, and they try to raise money too, because it's all about monetizing this for 4 hours, and have all these people cycle in. And that's where, if you're not actually someone, and I'm not someone who wants to go in and take an alias and go into like Telegram or Parler and try to track these groups, it's in these long interviews and these live streams where you can actually learn a lot more about what these networks are and who is hanging out with who got married, who had babies, and what kind of a community they're building. One of the people that they sometimes have on is this I think his name is Jason Cohn, and he's part of this group that has written, like there's one called The Great Order. Jason, that's one of the guys. There's another guy who's written a book about white guilt. And so they have started this new journal called the White People's Quarterly and the White People's Press. I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is this is also like their whole gist is community building community among whites, and, in a way that is not overtly neo-Nazi, that is not even over, they say it's more apolitical what they're doing. It's very politicized, obviously. It's all about building white identity politics in a very exclusionary way, that if you poke at it at all, you'll see kind of the xenophobia and the racism as well as the sexism come right out. So I would say that is an effective strategy on their part. So I think you can find these different dimensions that you're talking about. I view it as like, basically this is a multifaceted, sphere where these parts are interconnected, but you will see different aspects of it depending on where you look. I've also described it as a set of like overlapping Venn diagrams that sometimes connect with each other and sometimes don't, but share this, what binds them together is basically a very intense anti-democratic values. With a small d.
Yes, yeah, that which puts them in one of the kind of distinctions that is often made between the radical and the extreme right. That puts them more towards the extreme end of that distinction. And you mentioned also the Pacific Northwest, and that's let's talk about why that's significant. I think that's maybe opaque to quite a lot of people. Tell us about Wilmot Robertson.
So Wilmot Robertson is was a far right author who published basically as a pseudonym for someone who published 2 books that have been very well, 2 books and also a journal, all of which were very influential in basically, as we were talking about before, these kind of overlapping waves in connecting these waves and connecting these ideologies. So his first book he published in and I have it right here. It's called, and I'm actually looking at it right now. It was called The Dispossessed Majority, and it was published in 1972, which is pretty interesting that it was published that early. And I'm thinking of it in the context of this is 7 years after the the change in immigration laws in the United States, when it wasn't clear to some of those who would affiliate with the far right that the changes in immigration law would really play a key role in changing the demographic makeup of the United States. You couldn't quite, that did not become really apparent until the 80s or the 90s. In any case, the dispossessed majority is basically, the title says it all. It's really about this fear of whites being dispossessed, being overrun. And, it's very anti-Semitic. Jews are at the center of all of this because Jews are seen as the ultimate manipulators and, very Machiavellian in their plotting and conspiracies to have kind of control and domination through divide and conquer strategies, through promoting women's liberation and, the Black Power movement or whatever, all of the things that he would add into the mix. So he publishes that book in 1972. At the same time, he then starts a journal called Instauration, which some of your listeners may have seen. And, it's an anti-Semitic screed kind of month after month. I think that the kind of work that he's doing in that journal then helps lead to the publication of the Ethnostate, which comes out, I think it's in 1992 that it's published. So it's about 20 years later. And the interesting thing there's many interesting things about the Ethnostate. The first is that basically that is just the title, that is the concept, that is the anchor concept for him. And his thought is that, okay, if we go back to 1972, whites were becoming a dispossessed majority, there still was a possibility for them to be a majority, right? If the immigration laws were strengthened, if certain policy changes were made, if, things were able to really go back to the 1950s when whites were almost 90% of the US population, et cetera, et cetera. But by 1992, he's lost that hope that whites can be a majority and thinks the only salvation for whites is to have their own distinct ethnostate, which is an autarchotic, self-sufficient space that would be racially homogenous. And one of the shifts that you also see in this is that this becomes a talking point for white nationalists today, is that they don't want to, what they will say is, we don't want to oppress or kind of rule over other people. We don't want to live in a multiracial state like South Africa, where whites are, trying to, control everyone else. We're much more generous than that. We think everyone should have their own ethnostate, and we'll start with us, because we will have the best ethnostate. And if, one of the arguments he makes in the book is that whites are so superior, that they will set a model. This will become like the paragon of ethnostates, whatever they create. Blacks can then have an ethnostate in the South. Mexicans and Latinos can go back to the ethnostate they once dreamed of as a decolonial project, Aztlán in the Southwest. He doesn't have much to say about Asians, and he thinks Jews can either go to Israel or live in the East River of Manhattan. I mean, he literally says that those are the two options for Jews, but they cannot live in the white ethnostate because they are it's seeming with anti-Semitism. So then to build on this concept, and this is a kind of a dynamic that we see over and over again, he draws from ideas from the left. So he particularly draws from this idea of the bioregion, which has been developed by those in the ecology movement, thinking about, basically like natural territorial boundaries or natural boundaries of ecosystems. In the US, you would think of, lines of division, which might be like the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Nevadas or the Ozarks. And in fact, there's a conference held in 1980, which is about bioregions. And most of it is people connected to like the fledgling Green Party and kind of lefty environmental groups. And, it's folks who want to be self-sufficient, who do organic farming, all of that. And some of the first bioregion concepts are developed there, such as Ozarkia. And then, of course, one that has a longer historical resonance, which is Cascadia, And now we move to the Pacific Northwest, which is seen as like one of the premier bioregions because A, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful part of the country. B, there is enough soil and farming and agriculture to keep people going. It also has connection to the ocean and ports for traffic, for transit and trade if needed. And so he is most excited in terms of white people of two potential regions in the US for a white ethnostate. One is the Pacific Northwest, and the other would be kind of the Northeast New England, which are seen as the first as the New England one, and there's different names that are used for that by different people, but that would basically, harken back to, kind of the founders of the country and to 1776 and, kind of Puritans and WASPs. The Pacific Northwest is seen as kind of more of a manifest destiny, reinvent yourself in the US West idea. And, there, as we saw in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were a good number of far right actors who moved to the West. They might not have made it all the way to the Pacific Northwest, but they, for example, Aryan nations with their connections in Idaho and Wyoming and, really kind of the eastern part of Washington State and Oregon, and those groups are still there. If you think of, what is his name? I'm trying to remember his name. It'll come to me.
Covington?
Yes, Covington, Harold Covington.
Harold Covington, on Dick Covington.
Yes,
Harold Covington.
We put it together. His name together. Yeah. So he was someone who very much, in a failed attempt, but nonetheless attempt to sell this brand of kind of Cascadia and the Pacific Northwest. And I think one of so the Pacific Northwest, for all those reasons, plus the demographics were seen as very favorable by white nationalists because, the population was at that time, like even in the 90s, 90% white, with more Asians than any other ethnic group. Things have changed. All of those states have changed. All of them are becoming more diverse. And of course, Oregon was one of the few Western states to actually have, kind of an anti-miscegenation and an, anti-Black clause in it. So there's Oregon and Portland, Oregon, where we know the Proud Boys have been active, Patriot Prayer. I mean, that is like a state where you have the clash of these ideas from, the kind of what we think of as kind of the environmentally minded, social left, and then the far right actors and all of those. But yeah, so the ethnostate is, I think it's interesting. When I was working on the book, I tried to find out what was the first use of the word ethnostate. And the farthest back I could get was right after World War II, when the term began to be used by kind of more bureaucrats who were working in the kind of post-colonial space of Africa and thinking about how are these new nations going to be formed out of these colonial, these decolonized spaces where there are so many different ethnic overlaps, alliances, and tensions, as we know from the strife that unfolded in, various parts of kind of Western and Northern Africa over those years. But so that's where it starts in political science. I don't exactly know how Robertson, where he finds it, but once he finds it, he holds on to it tightly. And, he pulls all these ideas into it. He pulls the eugenic ideas of kind of, we're going to have a ethnostate of superiorly bred white people. He pulls in the ideas from kind of ecology and the left about sustainability and these romantic ideas of the bioregion. So he pulls all of this together, and such that I think it has a very powerful impact, and particularly in the US case. I would say less so in Europe, although I'd be interested to hear your take on that. It really has become kind of one of the key concepts for white nationalists, and even for those who are they are not affiliated with white nationalist organizations. For example, I don't know if you know, in Michigan, there were a militia group had wanted to kidnap and kill the governor of my state. And so I looked into the writings and the transcripts of the FBI agent, and they kept going back to this idea, we want to overthrow the governor. We don't like the rules she's put down for COVID, and we want to create a self-sufficient state, somewhere in the Midwest with a conglomeration of of our people. And these guys I don't think they first and foremost started off, with any of the white supremacist organizations we would think of, but they gravitated towards that idea because that's the idea. It's one of whiteness and self-sufficiency and their own kind of twisted version of what human biodiversity means.
Yes, that's extremely thorough. Thank you very much. I was wondering about this, the kind of classification of white, or the kind of the limits of whiteness, because if you think about the previous kind of generation of people who are trying to limit immigration to America, Madison, Grant, Lothrop, Stoppard, and so on, then they're trying to limit the immigration of people who we would unambiguously think of today as white. For example, Italians and Greeks and even Polish people, right? Like, who are obviously white, in a kind of a, in a conventional sense, or like the conventional sense is now. I'm wondering, like, does Robertson have the same kind of distinctions that we would use now for describing like people as white, or is there been a change since the either from the early 70s or from the early 90s?
Yeah, I mean, in the dispossessed majority, Robertson goes through a discussion of who are the assimilable and the unassimilable whites. And the ones that can be assimilated are those that you basically listed, who were, the nemesises of Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard and others who were involved in the 1924 Immigration Act, where, basically they didn't like the Mediterraneans, they didn't like the Alpines, but the Nordics were the ones, who should keep coming into the US and, should kind of set the phenotypical and demographic, mark for the rest of the country. I think one of the things that we see and that, historians have shown very well is that after the passage of the 1924 Act and its implementation, this dynamic emerges where, Italians can become white, Southern Europeans can become white, some Eastern Europeans can become white, and even, kind of sentiment against the Irish, which had been around a lot in the 19th century, that dissipates. So you get this, whiteness itself, it's not a fixed category. It's always a process of contestation of who's in and who's out, but that group expands to include, a broader array of kind of folks, let's say, of the European diaspora, the white European diaspora, at the same time that the lines are much more clearly drawn between whites and Latinos, for example, whites and Mexicans, whites and Asians. And of course, that is against the backdrop of, a system of racial apartheid that is in place in the United States. Some could argue even to this day in some way, shape, or forms, although there were, significant progress was made in the, with the civil rights movement and so on. So I would say, yes, that category of whiteness changed. However, there are a few constants in it. First, Jews can never be considered white. They're always outside the bounds of whiteness. Occasionally, you'll find a white nationalist who thinks Jews would be okay, especially if they brought a lot of cash to the ethnostate.
Yeah, Jared Taylor has this position, right? Jared Taylor of American Renaissance. He believes that, and this has caused a huge rift between him and other white nationalists. Yeah.
So, and then there's some who are a little bit softer on Asians, or even on Latinos who might have more kind of Spanish heritage, or, let's say, Spanish heritage, or be kind of the whiter or the whiter ilk. So I would say that does change. At this point, it's a really interesting question of like, what does white mean to white nationalists? And, one of the things that Greg Johnson says is that, you know it when you see it. He said, just like this, he literally has said this, if you go to the grocery store, if you can tell the difference between a cabbage and a lettuce, that's the same dynamic as, basically having like white dar, like you will know the white person when you see them. At the same time, the advent of like recreational ancestry testing and genetic testing has created this huge boom for white nationalists who want to prove that they are white by proving their ancestry is 80% Scottish or whatever. what's really interesting is there's a scholar, he's a sociologist at UCLA, and he and colleagues did a study looking at Stormfront and looking particularly at the bulletin board there that's focused on ancestry testing. And what they found is that, yes, many white nationalists will, claim their whiteness, and they will hold up their, percentage of, kind of European ancestry as proof of that. But those who find that they have more Asian ancestry or more even African ancestry, they will then kind of basically say things like, well, I know culturally I'm white, or I feel 100% white, or I know that like that transcendently I'm white. And so I think that's really interesting. So that reflects these, how whiteness can be understood by people who really want to possess it and claim it as a primary idea, a primary identification. And the slipper, it's all very slippery, which is another aspect of this.
Yeah, I mean, in America, as far as I understand it, there was a long-standing tradition of kind of the one-drop rule, right? If you heard, yeah. Whereas, of course, in South Africa, in the apartheid regime, that was suggested and then immediately stepped away from when it was discovered that pretty much all white people in South Africa have some non-white admixture. You had this like really kind of really interesting tension between the New England ethnostate and the Pacific ethnostate, and I wonder if it suggests a binary that is actually very kind of interesting in terms of thinking about like rootedness and placeness of white people. So it's very obvious that white Europeans are not the first people to live in the Americas, very obviously. And yet, like one of the people who Robertson, I think, lists in his list of people who must be kind of ejected from the white ethnostate or must be ejected from America, even because they are messing up with the kind of the First Nations people, or the indigenous people of America. But I'm wondering, how does, in this relationship to the land, or specifically to nature, how does this figure of indigeneity play itself out in the American context? In the European context, it's very obvious. There are in-place populations in European countries who can just say, "Oh, we are the indigenous people of these populations," and everyone else has to leave. In America, it seems radically unclear. And I was just thinking back to kind of Madison Grant and his 1936 book, I think it is, Conquest of a Nation.
Yeah.
Conquest of a Continent, sorry, where the marker of whiteness becomes not its indigeneity or its rootedness or its care for nature in a particular locale, but its capacity for continent dominating prowess, I guess. And I wonder if there's a kind of a tension between the New England ethnostate, which seems to be like, we are whites and we are in a particular place, and the Pacific ethnostate, which of course comes after a significantly longer period of expansion. That seems to be that, and so the first one is marking out something like indigeneity discourse, but somehow in New England, and the second one is marking out conquest discourse or whiteness as a mode of conquest. Maybe that's just pure speculation on my part, but do you see there's a kind of tension between these two different images of whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting way of framing it. I mean, the way that I would view white nationalist approaches to indigeneity or native peoples is either one of, well, it's mainly either expulsion or expected obsolescence, as well as often in conjunction with massive appropriation. So I mean that, so I'll unpack that a little bit. So in terms of, I mean, there is a kind of an understanding and assumption that since whites are the most evolved and are superior, that, that's kind of along the lines with the disappearing race or manifest destiny. And that's, that is captured to some extent in the Pacific Northwest, where there is this idea, and Covington captures that in his novels, which is about, kind of ragtag pioneers, white guys who are, fighting for survival and are going to make this land theirs and are going to set it up for them and their families, evoking the 14 words and so on. So there's that kind of thing. I mean, I would say that also is at play in New England, although it might be a little bit tamer, and it buys into this idea of kind of, the Mayflower and going back to kind of the, these long-standing kind of WASP type dynasties that are evoked by some, who want to have that lineage. So I would say that is there, but really it's about, either expectation of expulsion, actual expulsion, or I would say this appropriation is important in a few ways. The first is that, if you look at, their romanticized ideas of some of the Indians, that they know the land best, that they knew how to track, that they knew how to hunt, that they knew what to do with certain weather patterns, just like whites in an ethnostate will want to do, so that they could, be in environmental harmony with their bioregion and so on and so forth, and be able to, provide for their community. I mean, that's kind of this romantic idea that some of them have. And then also this idea of kind of like the primal warrior, and that this is where you get into a lot of like ideas of white masculinity. Like white men are the most evolved, they're both the most evolved intellectually and technologically, but also have the most kind of primordial heft, let's say, and the ability to kind of, transcend and be almost godly or be spiritual. And so there's this idea of kind of this connection to the land, and this male primordial connection to the land, which then is identified with, Native Americans who are seen as having that as well. So it's like deflection, appropriation, and which is itself, it's a form of erasure. These are all forms of erasure of different types, and it's about repossessing, Native cultures. So I think that, the romanticism of, and the last thing I was going to say is that there is a kind of analogy that's sometimes made among white nationalists where they identify with Native Americans as a disappearing race, or as a dispossessed race, or as the community that was, dislodged by, an unfortunate form of progress and conquest. So there's multiple uses of kind of indigeneity in the Native, and all of them involve erasure and, disrespect for Native peoples and cultures, if not their expected annihilation. So it's quite ugly.
For sure. I think that last point is really, really crucial about maybe you're obviously the expert on this topic, so maybe you can correct me, but like my understanding is that at least some of late 19th century eugenical discourse was based around the assumed obsolescence or the assumed dying out of indigenous peoples. So there's lots of kind of a spate of late 19th century anthropological work that just assumes that within 25 years, all of the indigenous peoples of, say, Australia will be dead and will all just be gone. And at least some of the kind of like impetus for eugenic sculpting, I don't know how to say, I don't know what the verb for doing eugenics is, but some of the impulse for doing eugenics, at least, is to say, well, we don't want to die out like these people. I have one further question, which I think is sorry, and then I've trespassed on your time long enough. But thank you very much for doing this. It's been really interesting and exciting conversation. You wrote the book, and it kind of finished sometime, you said earlier, in spring 2019, all right? Yes. So since then, Christchurch shooting has happened. It seems to me like the brand of the alt-right totally dissipated, almost completely dissipated. The dominance of far-right tropes on the internet has massively waned. Obviously, for the last 9 months or so, almost all of the world has been inside most of the time. What's changed? And yet, the titular group of the book, the Proud Boys, has undergone a sort of various kinds of transformation. There've been perhaps a kind of a palace coup or something of that nature that's happened in between various fractions inside it. Obviously, Trump, which I think was the kind of the enabling accelerant, not the cause, but the accelerant of a great deal of this this kind of wave. He's no longer in office, or this won't be probably in a month. What next? What's going to happen now?
Well, I'm actually very concerned about what's going to happen next, because I think that, Trump's electoral defeat, which is still playing out as he attempts to wage something of a coup, or, it's not a very well-designed political machinations that he's involved in, but he does not want to leave, and he either thinks he won the election or he is using that as a talking point to, it doesn't really matter. But so I think that, he has riled up millions and millions of people. Not all of those people are on the far right, but they are more likely to be associated with it now and to even be aware of groups such as there are a range of groups in the US that I don't think you have in Europe, such as the Oath Keepers. These are like, gun-toting guys who want to protect the Second Amendment and have, really far-right tendencies. They like the idea of a civil war and civil strife. They want to protect things, quote unquote, on their terms. So the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers. So there's a range of these different groups. And then there's smaller, more regional militia type groups, like the one I was mentioning in the context of Michigan. There's even one that dubbed itself the Wolverine Watchmen as kind of a nod from Marvel and all of that. So I think there are many of these groups. I think some of them are organized. I think some of them come together quickly because they're able to use social media technologies or things like that Zello app, which is a, one of these kind of like radio, what do you call it? Walkie-talkie type, walkie-talkie type technologies. So I'm very concerned about these groups for a few reasons. First of all, they have been galvanized by many of them by COVID and by COVID public health measures. So you saw in the US, these rallies where people with, we're talking about heavy duty, guns and whatnot, we're often wearing camouflage, who had watched that documentary Plandemic and, were kind of versed in all of that, descending upon state capitals. Those people then morphed into and connected with the Stop the Steal, which is those who believe in electoral fraud. And they keep appearing. So, for example, at the rally last week or a week or two ago in DC, the Stop the Steal rally, one of the most, kind of vocal speakers was Nick Fuentes from America First. So, this has given them all a platform. At the same time, if we go back to, we started off this conversation with 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. And that was the catalyst for those who might have believed in birtherism or were afraid of and horrified that there was a Black president, to go off and to stockpile arms and to, begin to maybe move towards this idea of agreeing somewhat with white identity politics or white men who felt that their place in society was being disrupted by diversity discourse. And so if you look at Biden's cabinet, which is the most diverse cabinet we've ever had in the United States, which I think is fantastic. It's such a relief that he won the presidency, if we can just finally get them into office. I know there's critiques of him from AOC and others, but whatever, given the alternative, it would have been a truly terrifying situation, I feel, if Trump had actually won the election. And, he still had 71 million people that voted for him. But so I see this as, with Biden will be a catalyst for some of these groups to continue to organize, to participate, in the opposition, to be the dissident right that the dissident right has always hoped existed. And, much has been made of the fact that, some of these people have been deplatformed. So, they've been thrown off of Twitter, they've been thrown off of YouTube. But that doesn't mean they've gone away. And, there are other platforms, from Parler to BitChute to so on that they can use. And the other thing is that I would say that you can see ways in which this far right ideas have been more and more mainstreamed, and it is acceptable to use them in regular political discourse. So even though these people, and I think of one candidate in particular who ran for Senate and failed in the Northeast, she didn't win her election, but she continues to pipe away on, to spout on Twitter about everything that is a white nationalist talking point about the Great Replacement, about the problems with diversity, about this, that, and the other. So I'm very concerned about where we're going. I mean, this is not going away. In fact, being in the oppositional stance in a way can be very productive for these types of groups. It can allow them to make more connections where those connections ideologically perhaps did not exist before. And I think that it's going to be, it's even as we come out of the pandemic too, which is another thing, once people are actually out and about and interacting more socially, what is the world going to look like? How are these groups going to capitalize on that? And so I am concerned about what things are I think it's going to be really rocky in the US for the next 4 years and maybe beyond.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. I think a couple of the other things I think are kind of worth mentioning is that Covington, who we mentioned earlier, Harold Covington, who wrote The Brigade, which is like kind of a leafier version of the Turner Diaries, if you will. He died in 2018, I think, sometime, around then. And he was immediately kind of replaced as the leader of a breakaway network by Norman Spear, who was the kind of pseudonymous leader of the group called The Base. And The Base, as far as I understand it, was in an attempt to kind of like launch a kind of guerrilla war in order to, or thought of itself as a kind of, I mean, the model they were using was the IRA. They thought of themselves as the militant wing of a separatist organization which would take over the Northwest. At least that's how Norman Spear spoke about it in at least one interview. So I think there's also this kind of process by which, like, as you deplatform people, they also like harden and harden and harden and harden. I think, there's so much more to ask about with the relationship between, the militia movement and the 3%ers and Oath Keepers and so on. And even QAnon, right, which gives a kind of a shared conspiratorial language to a great number of these groups. Not all of them, but a great deal of these groups seem to be at least flirting with the kind of the hugely amorphous memeplex of QAnon. But I will ask you no more questions. That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Alexandra Stern. Go and buy Proud Boys and the White Ethnostate. It's out now from Beacon Press. Really, really highly recommended. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to make those pompous academics regret kicking out such a genius. Deciding to build my lab and do my research.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Have you ever stared at a 500-page book and wish you could just talk to the author about their ideas instead? If so, the Time Talks Podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network, is for you, where we discuss history, politics, music, and art with an anti-authoritarian and anarchist perspective.
The Time Talks Podcast.
What's this light? I feel different.
The Time Talks Podcast.
12 Rules.